Notre invitée aujourd'hui est Ta-Nehisi Coates. Ta-Nehisi Coates, bonjour. Vous êtes journaliste pour le mensuel The Atlantic et vous êtes écrivain. Votre dernier ouvrage, Between the Word and Me, fut traduit et publié en français en 2016. Il s'intitule Une colère noire. Vous écrivez dans cet ouvrage, et de manière générale, vous écrivez sur votre expérience d'afro-américain, sur l'expérience et les difficultés de votre communauté. Et vous venez de passer presque une année en France. On va commencer par discuter du contexte dans lequel vous arrivez, à savoir que les États-Unis sont en campagne pour les élections présidentielles et qu'on voit émerger un candidat, Donald Trump, qui mise sur la peur de l'autre, sur la peur de l'immigrant, du musulman, sur la peur de l'afro-américain. En d'autres termes, on assiste à la fin de l'ère Obama et à la montée en puissance d'un homme politique qui a hésité à condamner les propos du Ku Klux Klan. Êtes-vous surpris, êtes-vous choqué par ce développement?
No, there's nothing to be shocked by at all. Donald Trump is not imposing himself on the Republican Party. Donald Trump is what, the base of the Republican Party is and has been. I mean, the modern Republican Party has, much of its roots, not entirely, but much of its roots in, the movement in the South to reject the reforms of the Civil Rights Movement in the 1960s. It's not a mistake that the same person who launched this racist birther attack against Barack Obama is now, the Republican nominee. Those are not mistakes. That's what the base is. And it's very difficult for people to come to terms with this. We would like to think that the rhetoric of Donald Trump is somehow distant from that of the portion of the American people that he represents in the Republican Party, but there's no real reason to think that. In fact, polling numbers say the exact opposite. So no, there's nothing to be surprised by. He is what his voters, expect him to be.
He says it loud.
Right, and if he weren't, he wouldn't be the Republican nominee. It's just that simple. I mean, the math is the math,
And would you say it's also the result of a period, like a few years of growing racial divides too? We've been talking a little bit about that in the past years.
No, I don't think growing. I think it is, well, here's what I'll say. I think having an African American as a president, having the African American actually in the driver's seat, I think that pulled out some latent, racism that was already there that people were more content with. But I don't know that it's particularly new or any worse. That's what the party is. A significant percentage of it, is made up by people, who regard being white as a particular interest, who believe that, and again, this is in polls, who believe that the big problem facing America right now is whites being discriminated against. I mean, that Donald Trump is who, the base, wants him to be. So it makes sense.
Yeah. Some kind of party to defend the interests of white people. I mean, it's really caricatural to say that things like that, but a little bit.
But that's what they are. I mean, there's just no other way to put it. When you have a presidential candidate, a presumptive nominee who celebrates Cinco de Mayo, like with a taco bowl or tacos or whatever he did, who proposes, banning Muslims, from the country. These scenes of violence, at his rallies. I mean, there's really no other way to put it. And Donald Trump has been this way for a long time. I mean, this is a guy who, when we had the Central Park 5 case here in New York, where you had these young men who, were accused of beating and, viciously assaulting and sexually assaulting this young woman. And the assault happened, but it turned out not to be them. Trump was calling for the death penalty for these boys. So, no, it's not a mistake. It's not a surprise. If anything, it's predictable. It's a direct reaction, as far as I'm concerned, to the fact of having a black president.
Avez-vous peur que cette situation politique, sociale, déjà très tendue, dégénère?
That's tough for me to answer, because African American communities are above, in terms of levels of violence, are above and beyond the normal level of violence that you see in America. I understand your question. You're talking about political violence. I understand that. But what I'm trying to link that to is even the kind of intimate violence that we think of as happening, between neighbor and neighbor violence in black communities. this is ultimately political violence too, because those communities look the way they look because laws were passed, structures were made, and people were put in certain positions. And so I don't know. I don't, you know.
Let's say it's already very violent.
It's already very violent. It's already very, very, very violent. You know, America as a country is already very, very, I mean, this is one of my observations from, you know, being abroad. America as a country is already a very, very violent country. You know, it just is. And so, I don't know.
It won't change that much.
No, I don't think so.
J'ai une dernière question sur le phénomène Trump. Il doit en partie son succès à ses émissions de télé-réalité, à ses casinos, aux matchs de catch qu'il a organisés. Vous êtes un écrivain, vous êtes afro-américain. Alors, est-ce que vous avez envie de parler au public de Donald Trump? Est-ce que vous avez envie de dialoguer et comment?
Obviously, I would like to. I would like to. I mean, I've had a couple encounters like that are very, very pleasing. But you write out of what's in here. You know, and my desire strongly was to represent my own experience. I don't think too much about, I mean, Between the World and Me had a shocking amount of success. I don't even know what to do with that. But the point is, it wasn't written to reach anybody. It's not translation. It's not, it is written as a letter to my son for a reason. You know, it's inside the circle, you know? That doesn't mean other people can't see it or shouldn't see it. I mean, but in terms of my desires, no, I didn't really write it thinking I was going to reach any particular audience beyond the audience that has some experience in what I was talking about in the book. Okay. Now, it may well be that audience is larger than I think it is, but, you know, and that it doesn't just include black people. Yeah. But my sense was not to, you know what I mean,
well,
to reach across the aisle or whatever.
But because the pieces that you write for The Atlantic are more or less angry, less personal. It's journalism
right.
Most of the times. And if I quote, for instance, the one you wrote, which it has to be put in a very American context, of course, the case for reparations, we could hope that some people who don't share your view or this analysis read that and think about it, right? I'm not sure they are reading The Atlantic, but right. It's really a question, like, how do we do to talk? I mean, it's a question even for French.
Well, you can't, you know, I don't
media.
think you can't make people intellectually curious. I mean, you just can't. I mean, I had a period in my life where I had to read a lot of things that I didn't agree with and didn't, you know, in many ways, frankly, respect my own humanity. I mean, any black person that's going to be any sort of intellectual thinking person in this society has to do that because we don't control, you know, the major organs of publication and that sort of thing. So you end up having to go out into the world and deal with things that definitely don't reflect your worldview. That's a weight that we have to carry. To ask us in addition to that, to carry the weight of having to reach out. In other words, to have to write that way, in addition to already having to read that way. That's too much. It takes all the joy out of writing, you know? People's own lack of intellectual curiosity and their own ignorance, that's their responsibility. They have to be curious enough to look out into the world and see what else is out there. I can't, you know, all I can do is write a piece like The Case for Reparations to the highest of my ability. I can't make people want to read it.
No, of course. It's just that I have the impression living in the US that there is really some separate bubbles.
Yes.
And people can live without ever hearing what people living, I don't know, in Harlem or,
right.
or in Brownsville
right.
are going through.
Right.
You can really live separated, totally separated. And,
right.
and that worries me. I mean, I'm wondering how it's possible to share experiences, at least to be able to hear about the other one. So it's more like, it's more a reflection than a question, I would
right.
say. But
it is. I don't know that we can. I mean, you figure we live in the most connected era in human history, and yet, you know what I mean? I mean, technology is there. You know what I mean? And yet, so I mean, you know, at some point, you get to, you know, who we are as, you know, human beings.
J'aimerais maintenant que l'on parle du réveil militant, du réveil de la gauche auquel on assiste aux États-Unis. Je parle à la fois du mouvement derrière Bernie Sanders, candidat à la présidentielle, candidat démocrate à la présidentielle, et je parle également du mouvement Black Lives Matter. Alors le lien entre les deux, c'est cette même quête de justice sociale, cette critique du néolibéralisme, et finalement le fait qu'on soit de plus en plus au croisement de la question raciale et de la question sociale. Comment vous analysez cette résurgence de la gauche aux États-Unis?
Well, I think, you know, I can speak most directly. Well, I think two things have happened. I think the issue of income inequality has given a lot of fuel to the idea that if you just let market forces do what they do, everyone will be all right and everything will be like that, you know. I mean, you see this widening gap, and so people are feeling it. In addition, America's still in the shadow of something that happened during the post-war economy, when you had all this boom and all these jobs everywhere. And in many people's minds, America is late 1940s, 1950s America. That's their idea of what America should be, even though it's actually a very, very brief period of time if you think about it. In America, that's what they think America is, you know? And it's clear that in the years followed that was not what America was, you know? And so I think in many ways folks are trying to get back to what they, you know, feel is a more egalitarian time. Now, black people never experienced that. So there was never any egalitarian America for black people, you know? And I think like this gets to one of the tensions, you know, that you see on the left for those who, you know, of us who are making a, you know, anti-racist critique, and, you know, folks who are more interested in, you know, in a anti-capitalist or a class critique, you know, income inequality is a very, very real thing. You know, there's the vast gulf between, you know, the rich, you know, and people who actually have to, you know, go out and work for a living is a real thing, and it's, you know, it's perceived. You can see it, you know, here in the city when you walk, you know, on the streets. You know, I get on the train, and you know, the number of homeless have shot up in this city, and the inability to, you know, to provide for folks, to have the actual compassion. This is real. One of the problems is, though, when you try to reach back for historical examples on the left for times when we did better for a workable thing, you run smack right into racism. In other words, the times when it worked, for instance, under Roosevelt, under whoever, you know, you end up having to deal with, you know, the fact that a lot of this was done on the backs of black people, you know, not directly in benefit, you know, for black people.
You mean you're saying that because you think it explains why so many, supposedly so many black Americans, voters are skeptical or not too interested by this
of like a Bernie Sanders?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, what is he saying specifically to their experience? Do you understand? And not even what, you know, what was Senator Sanders saying, but what has the movement behind Senator Sanders said to those people before? And I think, you know, what they would say is that they, you know, you speak to a kind of class consciousness among those people, you know, to see themselves as workers. But see, one of the things that this misses is that being black in America is in and of itself a class. It's a class almost outside of a class. You can't make, you know, good comparisons between black middle class people and white middle class people, black workers and white workers, black poor and white, because black people experience a kind of deprivation of wealth that is unlike any other group in this country. And so it's very, very hard, you know, to go in black communities and forge class, you know, that sort of, you know, cross-racial, as we would call it, class consciousness. At the same time, you go to white people and you try to forge that, you run into a similar problem because much of their status is caught up in not being black. This is, you know, a real issue and a real problem.
So at the same time, in the same period of time, we've seen the resurgence of a black activism that is try to restart, let's say, to restart the civil rights movement, kind of. So let's call it the Black Lives Matter movement. If really, for me, it's a collection of organizations, of small level of activism, local thing. But most of the people who are really into it, they try to connect what is related to racism, structural racism, institutional racism, and the neoliberalism, if I can use one word to summarize the thing. So they really try to do that, and it's pretty interesting.
Yeah. I mean, the problem is that the problem with trying to make those things cohere is that the kind of racism that black people have experienced, for instance, if you wanted to, you know, like I was talking earlier about the level of violence in the black community, if you go to East New York, you go up to Harlem, you know, Washington Heights, you know, the kind of violence, West Baltimore where I'm from, that you see these folks experience, like, is much older than neoliberalism. That's like the long, dream of the left, and particularly the white left in America, is the idea that, in fact, if you were not tied up in capitalism, you are not tied up in a market-based economy, that in fact is the source of all racism in this country. And it's just clearly not true. I mean, it's just so, clearly not true. I mean, put aside, the whole history of racism on the left. Let's just leave that aside. The idea of naming people and putting them in a group and then taking things from them is much, much older than the history of capitalism. That's what racism is in and of itself. There is no guarantee, and I think, like, this is my big critique. We're getting kind of hypothetical here, but there is no guarantee that if we had a fundamental change in what the economy is here, the black people would not still be on the bottom. There's just no, there's no guarantee of that. There's no guarantee of that.
But we have to try, maybe, no?
Yeah, but I think we have to try with some consciousness about history. You know what I mean? With some sort of awareness that within the DNA of the country that we're trying to change, that we're trying to alter, is the idea that these people should be on the bottom. That's our history. That's our history. It's like, I always tell these people, it's like being an alcoholic. You can't pretend, hey, I'm going to go into a bar and watch, a bunch of people, knock them back, and I'm going to be okay, and everything is going to be okay, and I don't have to do anything, to deal with, my own sickness. You can't say, I'm going to continue to eat Twinkies and cupcakes every day, and still somehow I'm going to lose 50 pounds. I mean, you have to have some sort of understanding of the forces at work, and history is a very, very, very real force. And if we don't speak to the need to be vigilant about that, you just end up repeating again.
I just have one last question about the Black Lives Matter movement specifically, right, because you just talked about a white left. So right, maybe what's going on is also the awakening of a black left. A lot of young people who are super into it, and behind, again, this label, Black Lives Matter. Do you follow these activists?
Yeah, of course I do, yes.
Do you talk to them? What's your role in that?
Not too much. I've met one and spent some time with one, but not too much. I try to keep my distance, actually, to let them do what they're doing, which is beautiful and excellent, and I think is incredible and messy. I think is the continuation of one of the great political traditions in this country, and that is black activism. And so.
Do you see the demands? It's not very clear sometimes to me.
Yeah, I think they're doing something a little different, though. I think what it is what they're trying to do is provide some sort of network, for different outlets of energy. I think they don't want to be centralized, which I understand. You know what I mean? It might not be what I would do, but I understand the desire to be decentralized. You know what I mean? To allow different people in different cities to localize and ask for specific things, as opposed to saying nationally, here's our national platform for act. I mean, that has weaknesses too. So I think it's a considered strategy.
Yeah, what is interesting is that when we can see, when I go on campus, and I try to go as much as I can because it's so interesting to see the students right now. They're really into this period of, okay, we get a strong political conscience, right? But still have some difficulty to see the agenda. So maybe that's not, as you said, maybe the beginning is just to build a network.
Right.
But do you think there is one thing in the future that can come out from that? I don't know, some kind of, even some simple laws that could change the political
I think it's
violence?
already started, though. I think it's already started. I mean, New York City passed a law, I believe in the last year, where they're going to, for the first time, really record, every, instance of violence or something like that. I might be getting the law wrong. The uptick in the desire for body cameras, you see actually, stuff like that actually passing in cities. There've been a number of local reforms. What's happening with Rahm Emanuel in Chicago right now, with all of that, with him having, to allow all of that information out. I mean, these guys toppled a police chief, in that city. So I think regardless of whether they have a platform, one of the critiques people make is, well, no tangible reform is well, that's not actually true. Things have actually happened, and I think we'll continue to. The Ferguson report, which I think is just remarkable, for its depiction of, basically, a city turning an entire community into a slush fund, and really just, extracting resources out of that community. That doesn't happen without the kind of activism you saw in Ferguson. It just wouldn't be there without it.
Il y a une dernière chose dont nous devons parler, c'est de la France, puisque vous avez donc passé près d'une année en France, en congé sabbatique. Le but, c'était pour vous de prendre vos distances avec les États-Unis, d'être considéré comme autre chose que comme un afro-américain, peut-être juste d'être considéré comme un américain, vous le dites dans votre ouvrage. Alors, est-ce que ce séjour vous a apporté ce que vous cherchiez?
Yeah, and I think, just to be clear about that, like, well, I mean, one of the things that happens is, you get there and, you speak your horrible French and they immediately know you're American. And that is the lens through which people, see you. I, went to Paris for the first time in March of 2013. And, I fell in love right away. And that continued. I didn't want to come back, to be honest. I had to come back because there was business here I had to deal with. I think one of the things that people need to understand is like why you feel at home in different places. And whenever you talk about Paris, like it's very similar to New York in the sense that it's like a lightning rod for people's emotions. And so if you say, like, I liked Paris, like, that becomes all sorts of things, especially if you're black and you say that. Like, it becomes all sorts of, well, they're racist too, da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da. But there are reasons, like, to go places and to love things, besides, like, escaping racism. And you're never going to escape it anyway, and here's why. Even if individually, as an African-American, I was treated differently because I'm American. Because of my history here, because of who I am, because of everything that is in my bones. One of the things, and I, obviously talked to you about this, one of the things I immediately, sought out was, the diaspora there. I mean, you can't, I mean, maybe some people can, but, me and my biography, like, I couldn't, like, live alone there. You know what I mean? I couldn't just, okay, let me just go into, the dream. I found the Black and Arab communities there to be, I mean, at least the activists I talked to be like so, and the public I talked to whenever I would talk about the book, to be so engaged and so like on fire, I think a lot of times as African Americans, we take for granted what privileges we have as activists and as writers. So for instance, something as silly as like, for African American journalists, there's this organization called NABJ, National Association of Black Journalists, right? This exists. Well, this wouldn't really exist in France, right? You know what I mean? Like, so even having a network like that of people that, like that, you know what I mean? Like, it doesn't exist, you know what I mean? This goes out, an institution like what we would call in America, the Black church. Like, that doesn't really exist there in the same way. It just doesn't have, of course, Black people that go to church, but it's not the same thing, you know what I mean? Because of the intense history of Jim Crow. What I'm saying is, what I felt was a lack of spaces for people to talk. And so when people did come together to talk, I mean, it was like fire. I mean, it was so hot. I did this thing at Musée d'Aper, and they gave us, I think, an hour to answer questions, and the Q&A question period was over, and people got upset. So they had to extend the Q&A because people, they just want to talk. I mean, they're so, upset.
That's interesting. That's so interesting you say that, because I remember in your book also you say kind of you can't breathe here. In France, now as sometimes a foreigner to my own country because I live here, I feel in France, especially on the issues of race and racism and discriminations, because of this lack of label, this lack of space,
right.
People can't breathe.
Right.
Like they and the country is small too, so
right.
it's like physically there's
right.
not even enough space to be
right.
able to say things, and that is not always a huge debate about that, just to say things and
right.
talk, and maybe that's why also so many people there needed to talk to you, just to have an experience to compare to, and how do you do to be a voice, and a respected voice.
Yeah. Well, what became clear to me was that if the book did anything, it opened the opportunity for people to talk. A lot of that stuff actually had nothing to do with the book. It was the fact the book had done well there, and that meant that you can now, begin to convene people, you know what I mean, and put them together and, put a bunch of people in the same room and they can talk about, they can see the book through the lens of their local struggles, and what's going on. It was, I mean, that was probably one of the more, getting to know the Black and Arab communities, that was probably one of the more touching things I had. I mean, we did this thing out at Perry Wheat, like about a week before I left. This thing went like 4.5 hours. I mean,
with the students?
Yeah, it was way too long. But at the same time, it was like great, you know what I mean? At the same time, so it was like the students and the professors and everybody talked. And it just, it was intense. It was really, really, really intense, you know what I mean? But it was good. I mean, it was really, really, really good. I mean, that was like, for me, one of the most, enlightening parts of being there. To
listen to the young Black and Arab and whoever they are, actually, even white people, really sensitive to the racism. Yes,
and then listen to like people talk about oppression, but outside of the context of the kind of harsh segregation. You see, and you understand that there's a different kind of oppression that can actually work. You mean
when they're in university?
Well, no, like so I went to Howard University. That's where I went, right? There's no real French version of Howard University. It can't exist within the society. The very institutions of African-American life in this country were formed by very harsh and severe segregation. In France, it's different. The dream is different. The dream is we're all French. And so there's some kind of, lip service, and I guess, I shouldn't just say lip service, some sort of effort to make that real, but in the areas where it falls down, the problem is different. People feel voiceless. They don't have the same institutions to organize as community outside of their Frenchness. You know what I mean? There's no other way to come together and then voice complaints. The only lens to do it through is through being French. You know what I mean? And so these small, I guess what I would say is like minority communities. I mean, that's really the best word to say it. There's no way for a minority community, I shouldn't say no way, you have the mosque. I mean, you do have other ways, but the networks, the tools to organize as minority communities, to talk amongst yourselves, the vessels for that are much, much less. And that's a different, kind of, oppression. That's a different kind of, so when somebody disappears, right, and they, and the police take them into the station house and the police come and tell you, oh, I'm sorry, he's dead. And they act like they don't know what happened. You know what I mean? Well, how do you, what are the vessels to get? You said what?
How do you exist?
Yeah, how do you exist? Right. I mean, and how do you mourn? I mean, obviously there's a great tradition of protest in the country, but can you do what Black Lives Matter did? Can you do that the same way? I mean, think about how they organized, right? I mean, think about how they were able to go city to city to city through various networks, and then, you know what I mean? Can that happen? I'm asking the question too. Like, I'm not making a charge. I'm actually asking the question.
Well, we'll try with this series of interviews to find some answers. So I'll tell you.
Okay.
Thank you so much, Tennessee.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Thanks a lot, and thanks Albertine for having us.